Hi, I'm Keegan Connor Tracy, and I am so delighted to be part of Canada Reads, especially because I am championing this fabulous book, Greenwood by Michael Christie. So I just want to welcome Michael. I get to ask him questions. This is my finally I get to be a host on CBC.
Hi, Keegan. Thanks for doing this. I'm excited.
Me too, me too. Now, I guess I'm supposed to talk about why I chose to champion Greenwood. I mean, it was pretty easy. As I was casting about, I'm reading lots of beautiful books, but there was just something about this book that for me really felt Canadian because it really is a Canadian story. Not only because it goes from coast to coast and it talks about this and describes this beautiful country in just such a lush fashion with these beautiful descriptive paragraphs where you can really see these open plains. You can see these dense forests of the West Coast. I also chose it because it's a family story at its heart. Yes, it's about Canada. Yes, it's about natural resources. Yes, it's about forestry. But at its heart, it's about family, and it's about the ways in which if we cannot find a way to communicate with each other, our families can break down. And I think there's a really great parallel between that and everybody's family. We all have pieces of that within our families, but also like the Canadian family. If we can't find a way to talk to each other, how are we going to move forward? How are we going to have a great relationship as a country?
Absolutely. Yeah, you've explained it better than I can already. So I really appreciate that. No, it's very much a book about the environment for sure, but also family systems and the way that they interact with environmental systems as well. And so, at its root, I'm going to use a lot of tree words here. It's just something I do. But at its root, the book is about interconnectedness. I think are interconnected with one another, whether we're in families or we're not, as well as the interconnectedness with the natural world and the way that all these systems bleed together and become this whole that is life.
Yes, or a family or a country, right? I think
Totally.
that the metaphor is just ripe for the picking. I also found it really interesting in terms of thinking, like I've read The Secret Life of Trees, and we're learning a lot about how trees communicate underground, and I think again the parallels that we can draw both as families and as countries, it's just so sort of viscerally there, and it's for that reason that I really think that this is the book for all of Canada to read. So really, like for me as a storyteller, when I am writing something or when I'm approaching a role, either as an actor or a film or a project as a director, there's sort of like the seed of the story. And so I wonder what the seed of this story was for you. What inspired it? How did it come about?
This novel in particular began with this sort of notion of these particular characters. I just had some people that I was sort of obsessed with. I couldn't get them out of my head, and just started writing around them. And at a certain point, I realized they were living in different time periods, which was a big moment. And then at another point, I realized, maybe these people actually belong to the same sort of family unit. But it wasn't until I was cutting down a tree. When I wrote the book, I was living full-time on Galliano Island, and I was cutting down a tree to make way for a driveway we were putting in. And my kids were there, my sons, who were very young at the time, and they were there, and I'm not an experienced tree faller. I don't know if you can tell that by looking at me, but I watched some YouTube videos and I was well prepared. And so I cut down this tree. It fell. It was a big moment. The kids were really excited. And we were looking at the stump after, and I saw this structure of the tree. And, we were counting the rings back and trying to determine how old the tree was. And it just kind of struck me that this tree contained its own life story within itself, and that the most recent rings were the most recent years, and that it went all the way back to the very year that it began, which is the heartwood of the tree. And I thought that would be an interesting way to structure a novel. And I don't really believe in epiphanies, but too much, but this was one, and I had this kind of flash of inspiration, and I went and wrote this book.
For me, a lot of times, the people who become characters and things that I write, I call it stealing. I steal from life. I steal this scene from something and then I build around it. Is that how you approach writing characters as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's the character part of it is almost the sort of most spiritual part of writing, I think, in a way, and it's almost like I've used this metaphor before, but it's almost like, as a person, I'm just kind of passing a metal detector over the world as I walk around, and I see people and I meet people and I see things, learn things. And then every once in a while, they'll just be like a beep, 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 beep. And it won't mean that this person is who I should write about, but it just sort of, the beep sort of means there's something down there
Yes.
that needs to be written towards. And see, the writing is almost like the digging, And so I've been fascinated by trees in general for a long time, but also just like the people who are obsessed with them. I'm a carpenter myself, so obviously the carpenter character in Greenwood really, sort of shared many of my obsessions. But even at a deeper level, I think like the emotional core of somebody, someone who's living with loss, someone who is grieving, someone who's battling addiction, someone who is hiding a massive secret. These are the people that speak to me, and these are the people that I like to write about. Choosing a character is the closest part of writing, that's closest to love, I think, in a way. You want to write about someone that you love because you're going to spend a long time with them, and that's generally how I guide myself.
That was beautiful. That little, synopsis of that just struck me right in the feels when you said that. So this book came out for your pre-pandemic, about 4 years ago. What sort of has changed from when you wrote it originally to the way that we might look at it now?
God, yeah. I mean, certainly the environmental situation has gotten more dire, I would say. The heat dome, particularly in BC, happened after this book, which was a really sobering moment, I think, for everybody. Oh my God. Yeah. No, I was on Galliano at the time and going to see, mussels and intertidal life that had boiled in their shells from the heat and died, right? And so you're like, this is not normal, weather activity. And so that really hit it home for me. Not that I wasn't worried before. So certainly the climate crisis is only developing and is going to continue to be degrade the ecological systems. But also I think, post-pandemic, I really have been thinking a lot about our interconnectedness and our reliance on one another. And that's a big metaphor in this book, the trees, all this science around how trees communicate with one another. Even, between different species of trees, there's communication going on, and through fungal networks, through the ground. And there's actually, I think the scientists sort of are speculating now that 70% of all plants, not just trees, do some form of this interrelatedness, which is completely mind-blowing to me. And I think the pandemic really hit home, our interrelatedness with one another, both in terms of infecting each other, but then also in terms of caring for one another, and how important our communities are and how important our relationships are. And so, I feel like the book's resonances, at least for me anyway, have only kind of deepened over time.
So how much of this did you expect was going to become sort of a cautionary tale about the environment, which I think can throw some people off, right? If they think, oh, you're going to be preaching to me about the environment, which is really not what this book is about. I feel like it's sort of very gently living there under the surface. Was that intentional? Did you know it was going to have that level of sort of cautionary tale? Did you know you were going to go forward into the future to 2038, which, let me just say right here, feels like some dystopian future that's only 25 years away. This is not a time where you'll be like, I'll be dead, I don't have to worry about it. God willing, we will not be dead, and we will have to deal with it, and we need to deal with it now. How much of that was a part of you in your writing, what is ultimately a family tale?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that brings me back to fiction over and over again is its ability to take an idea and just look at it from all different sides without really signing off on any one particular perspective. And so, I wanted this book to be an environmental novel because that's what I'm thinking about lately. I mean, I was thinking a lot about ecology and trees, and things aren't going very well. But at the same time, you know, the odds of a literary, a 550-page literary novel being picked up by a climate change denier and then them having their mind changed by my incredible story is pretty much zero, you know? So I think what you can do as an artist, and this goes for all artistic fields, I think, is that you can deepen our understanding and complicate our understanding of a particular subject. And so I really, you know, wanted the book to not frame the environmental activists as these, you know, shining knights of hope, and then anybody who's ever cut down a tree as this kind of evil character. I really wanted to sort of just highlight our interdependence, I think, with trees, you know, and the human being's kind of interconnectedness with the natural world.
Yes, I think what it does is beg the question. It gives you something that is entertaining, and that begs the question also, like, look at your own family structure. Look, you know, at myself, you know, I have a very complicated relationship with my father, for example. And it's very easy to just look at that and be like, well, he didn't do this or he didn't do that. But then if you take a step back, you go one ring back in time and you look at the events that led to him becoming that kind of person, that then led him to be this kind of father, you know, you can extrapolate from what's happening in the book to the relationships that you have in your own life. And I think that's one of its really core strengths.
And I think this is a really, really reductive way of looking at fiction and art. But I think, for me at least, the very basic fundamental purpose of a lot of art is to just say, everybody's trying their best.
Yeah.
Everybody's doing their best with the tools that they have, you know, and hopefully this book suggests that about the Greenwood family as well.
Well, and I think it's something that's so easily forgotten in this time, especially of, you know, you have Twitter and everybody can be like, I don't like this, I don't like that.
Yeah.
You know, and everybody's an expert now. And one of the things that I really loved about this book is that it largely took place in the past before that, which for me, I find what I'm being drawn to right now, both in television and film and in literature, are books and stories that people are not holding their phones in. And I really loved that about this, that it just took me back in time. Speaking of which, this sort of leads me to, this is a bit of an inscrutable question, but like, I'm going to show you my tabs here. Can you see them? I don't know if there's too much light.
I can. Yeah, I can. Wow.
Hold them back here. There's like, I did the years, you know, they went through, and let's see if that shows it a little bit better. And it sort of did this little beautiful little triangle here. And I'm fascinated by the notion, it sort of has like this kind of quantum physics vibe to it, about how all of time exists at once.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely no physicist, so please accept my disclaimer here. But I was thinking a lot about time, and obviously trees put us in mind of a greater time scale than our own lives, which I think is a great, wonderful thing that trees do for us. I was at the ROM with my sons, and we were looking at, there's a giant cross section of a tree there, and it's like, we were looking back, and it's like the, you know, printing press invented, and it's like halfway through the tree trunk, you know, and you're like, this thing dwarfs human experience, this thing's life. And so and you know, I got it, not to get too metaphysical here, but the older I get, the more I have these weird feelings that your entire life is almost happening all at the same time, in a way, and that time isn't so as simple as we may think it is. And I have no explanation for any of this stuff, but I think the best art can reveal time in ways that, you know, just normal experience really doesn't, the day-to-day. So I loved that I could write a book that was presenting all these time periods happening in the same instant almost, and just looking at the resonances that developed between all of these people.
Yeah. There was one section, I feel like it was at the end. I can't remember where it is, but there's some notion of, you know, seeing the cross section of a tree that had been felled, and about how, you know, so much of recent time was this far from the edge, and there was still all these years and years and years and years. And, you know, one of the things that I think we should be lamenting as we are just opening our eyes to the kind of clear cutting of old growth forests, something about which I don't know a lot, but this book draws me to understand better. You know, I sign the thing, somebody sends it to me on Instagram, and I put it out on my channels. And, you know, it's so easy to feel like, well, I'm done with that, or the government is doing something. But are they? And what magnificence there is that lies in that we are not looking at. And perhaps when you see, like what you just described, that cross section of a huge old growth tree, we can come to understand time differently, understand how small we are in the grand scheme of it. But also, again, how it all leads, and there is a thread that goes through. And yeah, I just thought, you know, I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think there's a phrase in BC, you know, worth more standing, and it's you know, these trees are worth more standing than being brought down and turned into some kind of product. And I think, you know, we need to protect these spaces and to honor these spaces, almost like churches. I think there should be sort of like the natural wonders of the world and distinction for a lot of this stuff, and it should not be touched, and it should not be exploited or, you know, destroyed in any way. And so, yeah, I'm a firm believer in that the importance of protecting these spaces because of their spiritual significance and because of their importance to our story on this planet.
And you even make the allusion to that early in the book about, I was trying to see if I can find it, which of course I can't, the arboreal cathedral, you know, that you literally called it a cathedral. And I think when we think of it as a sacred space, we think differently about it. And even that you named one of your heroines temple, I thought it sort of felt like it tied together for me, you know?
Yeah, I'm a non-religious guy, but I think, you know, art gets us closer to these larger feelings than anything else. And I sort of have almost like a spiritual, I guess, connection with reading and with, you know, films and with stories that I love. And so, you know, I want all those choices were very, very deliberate. And, you know, I think in our search for meaning and in our search for, you know, connection, what better place than to turn to nature? I mean, you know, there's scientific studies that prove that, you know, time spent in nature is massively positive in terms of our mental health. I mean, certainly I was aware that I wanted to tell a story that would get at some pretty fundamental emotional stuff, while also you know, being like these people in particular. You know, the story of the Greenwood family is kind of the story of particularly the, you know, the settler colonial destruction of this land that we're living on. But it's also the story of this particular family and their struggles and their unique sort of like challenges they're facing.